Yes, we are going to talk about evidence. My name is Marcus Yanal. I am part of the BEAM team, and I'm responsible for BEAM's work on monitoring, evaluation, and evidence. Evidence has been on the center stage at BEAM from its inception. It's been part of its original business case already, and ever since we have been working on evidence. And now yesterday we have heard in the morning that we need evidence to make the case for market systems development, for market systems approaches, and in the end the questions, well actually, how much more evidence do we need? So we set out there and said, yes, let's check what is there, let's see what we already have. And we did a systematic search of evidence documents, and we put them on the BEAM website. So if you go to beamexchange.org, you will find there is what we call an evidence map that lays out everything we have found. Well, not everything that we have found, but everything we found and that passed our inclusion criteria, because we did put some criteria in there in order to make sure that what we put in would actually be useful. But what we did then as a subsequent activity is to write a review, to look at these documents and see what are they all about. And this was actually done by my colleague Finn O'Sullivan and Andrew Rylance. What was the purpose of this review? It was to see what is there, what kind of different evidence types do we have, want to illustrate some of the activities, some of the achievements of projects using market systems approaches. We had a little look into the scale that they were able to achieve, and obviously then trying to say, well, can we put here with this evidence base on the BEAM website, can we put a basis for assessing the validity of market systems approaches? Now let me get very, very briefly in the beginning, before we go into a discussion, walk through what we have found so far. So we looked, with the review, we looked around 70 documents that we found. We looked at what kind of documents that we found, and the majority of the cases of the documents are case studies. We found a few research reports, and we were a bit surprised that we didn't find that many impact evaluations. By sector, this wasn't a big surprise. The majority of the documents was from the agriculture sector, which is quite obvious because a lot of market systems approaches are applied in the agriculture sector. There are a couple of multi-sectoral documents. The financial services were up there. And then a few others with less evidence documents. And then we also asked the questions, well, what kind of impact level or result level do these documents address? And we took from the M4P operational guide, we took the M4P strategic framework to look at the different levels. So we have intervention level, we have changes at the level of the market system, we have changes at the level of access or growth, and we have then the ultimate impact level, poverty reduction. So here we also see that the majority of the documents talks about whether an intervention works or not. But we still could find some documents that actually talk about market systems change, about change in access and growth. And we also have a few that talk about the kind of ultimate impact of poverty reduction. So who wrote these documents? Well, you can see here that less than half were written by external people that came in and had a look at a project, and the other half, or more than half, were actually at least partly written or commissioned or written together with the program itself, with the people that are actually involved in implementing this program. So what can we say summarizing the evidence? It has been challenging. There were a couple of challenges we had to overcome. The documents were really, really diverse, but most of them were not commissioned to be evidence documents. So they were not commissioned to say, look, this is what we did and this is what came out of it, but they were commissioned for quite a range of purposes. Obviously, we were dependent on what was actually published, what was accessible. We couldn't go out and collect primary data. We couldn't go out and collect reports that weren't publicly available. And only a few of these documents represent after the effect assessments. Most of them were discussions of ongoing projects, the case studies describing ongoing projects that were still in the process of being implemented. And what we also found, and this is probably not surprising, is that there's a bias towards presenting the success stories. But what we want to take out of this is that we can actually harvest this diversity, that we can make conclusions out of this collection of different types of documents. We put the aggregate contribution of all of these documents above, looking at each individual one, saying whether it is actually useful or not. So collectively, this was painting a very, very rich picture about what market systems approaches can achieve. So in conclusion, we could find convincing examples of systemic impacts occurring at different sectors, in different countries, in different contexts. So we think it is possible to intervene to make markets work better for the poor. But there is obviously scope for improvement. There is scope to create better evidence documents to consolidate this finding. And we need your help for this. So everyone who is out there and thinks, oh, we have a lot of documents, we have this and this evidence document, please send it to us so we can add it to our evidence map. So before we go to the panel, I would like to again ask you to take out your voting cards. And I know I was very, very brief, but do you think this assessment of the evidence and harvesting the diversity of evidence documents, do you think this is adding value to the discussion around evidence? Green is yes, red is no, amber for not sure. All right, I don't see many red. I see some red. I see a lot of amber. Okay, thank you very much for this contribution. I would like to have a few, actually, voices of people who put a red card or a green card. Why do you think that this does add value to the discussion? Why do you think it does not add value? Could you just ask 2 or 3 people, 2 or 3 volunteers to let us know what they think? No one dares to say anything.
Surprising how few documents there are, actually. So I think for those of us that don't have time in our everyday lives to like go out and scan the entire environment, I think you've done a lot of the hard work for us. And it just kind of, I think, gives more, to all of us in the room, we need to be submitting the evidence and making sure that others can learn from it. So I think it just kind of raises that point. So I found it helpful in that regard. Thanks, Marcus.
Maybe we can have one more voice from this table over there.
Mark Thomas from Nathan. I just wondered if you'd included in your documents all the DFID annual reviews of all the DFID M4P programs, which are all available.
They were not included, but I don't want to go into the details now because it was quite a long discussion. But I'm happy to take that up. I don't want to take any time from our panelists, to be honest. And let me introduce the panelists to you. Elizabeth Dunn, who's sitting next to me. She's the principal investigator for monitoring and evaluation for the USAID-funded LEO project. She's a research economist, and she has more than 25 years of experience directing research and evaluation that is focused on market-based solution to poverty. Next to Elizabeth, we have Simon Stevens. He's the team leader for investment climate and infrastructure at DFID. He is an economist with over 20 years of experience in international development, out of which 16 are with DFID, working in UK and international policy as well as country and in global programs. Then next to Simon, we have Matt Ripley. He has a decade of experience implementing private sector development projects. He has previously led an agriculture team for a large M4P program in Nepal called Samarth, and is currently managing a project supporting the adoption of market systems approaches in the International Labour Organization. I would like to start a discussion on the panel here with Simon. A similar question I posed to the planner here. What is your assessment of the current debate on evidence, and where do you see that the politics play a role within, from a donor perspective, within the donor organizations?
Okay, thank you, Marcus. Yeah, so the debate on evidence, I mean, I suppose I'm not exactly sure how much debate there is. I mean, there's and it'll be good as we go through this discussion to drill down more into that. But you know, evidence evaluation has been around certainly for my whole career, and one of my first jobs was to carry out an evaluation for the Commonwealth Secretariat. So at the time it felt like early days of trying to see whether programs worked, but you know, I guess we must have many years of building up evidence, and that demand's not going to go away. We will, I think, later in this panel discuss types of evidence, and so I'm not going to go into that here, but as I say, it's clearly very important that we try and show what works, and we try and draw lessons from what doesn't work. And as I say, I think there's been many years of doing that. But thinking about this, I was thinking about, you know, back to the challenges that that Patricia and Jim put out in the very first session of this conference, and maybe the evidence map answers that question. I don't know, but yeah, one question was about the robust evidence we have for whether market systems approaches work. You know, do we have that evidence? I mean, I think that was a big question put out there. And as Jim said, there should be a number of really great stories that we can point to. You know, is the evidence map giving us that or not? So, or do we need to work harder after so many years of working on market systems approaches, M4P, that sort of program? Should we be working harder to draw those stories out? So that's one bit of sort of evidence on the story side. I thought I should talk a bit about numbers as well, because I know people get very heated about the fact that donors ask for numbers. And I'd say, again, that's something that's not going to go away, because numbers are very attractive to our political masters and very attractive to our communications people, because they look like they tell a very clear black and white story. Now, we all know that no story is black or white, but when you're communicating, that's what you need to put out there, and that's where numbers can be very powerful. And you know, anybody who's living in the UK at the moment through the EU referendum debate will have seen a lot of numbers thrown about for different purposes. But be that as it may, I think on everything we do, you know, say numbers play an important role in trying to tell our story. If we're being very purist about it, we might not like it, but I think it's it's important. And I think the other thing I was just thinking about the evidence map, as I say, is that does that do what we need? One thing we were discussing yesterday was, well, actually, as political changes happen, different questions get asked. So when you look at the impact studies and so on you have, well, somebody will say, okay, well, you know, that study shows that it has an impact on poor people, but what about the impact on women? What about the impact on disability? What are, you know, the focus shifts slightly, which I know makes it quite hard to have evidence that covers everything that might come up in the future. So now, just briefly on the politics, you know, how the politics plays a role in this. I'd say first of all that evidence I think really plays a really strong role, even as our political priorities change. You know, in the UK, there's no party leadership at the moment that argues that aid is not a good thing. There might be slightly different emphases on why we want aid, but all parties support the UK's commitment to provide 0.7% of GMP in overseas development assistance. And another thing I noticed recently on evidence, even across governments, I saw a document recently that referred to the Commission on Growth and Development, which was something that was set up under the Labour government in about 2008, and produced a study on exactly what was the evidence on what drove economic growth. That's still being quoted now, 8 years later, different government. The evidence can be carried across governments, can be kind of politically neutral. So I think we have a reasonably kind of wide area of consensus in the UK, but that's not to say that ideology can't play a role. And you can think of politics with a big P, the political parties. You think of small p politics in terms of what happens in our organisations. And I always think of one of my pre-DFID pieces of work where I was looking at technical assistance to generate investment from an investment bank, and there were two views about the technical assistance. One view was that the technical assistance was leveraging investment. The other view was that it was subsidising private investment. There were completely different ideological views, and in fact, numerically, one was just the inverse of the other. But you could argue it was one or the other. Leverage is a good thing. Subsidy is a bad thing. So even within the organisations, politics can play a role in how evidence is interpreted. Just the last thing I'd say on this is that politics in government, in the UK government, I'm sure other governments as well, it's not homogeneous. There's not one single view across the whole government. And evidence, I think one of the ways DFID in the UK government is really effective is how we use evidence in political discussions. We are able to draw on a huge number of studies in a variety of areas. And again, I've certainly worked in areas where the evidence and the quantitative analysis that DFID has been able to commission and draw on has been critical to swinging the debate towards a sort of development focus, where we have departments that will be focusing on agriculture, departments focusing on industry, departments are focusing on foreign affairs, all with quite different priorities. Evidence can be really critical in those debates.
So the demand for good, robust evidence is not going away. Also, the demand for numbers is not going away. Elizabeth, do you, as a seasoned evaluator, do you feel that we are on top of producing evidence that is technically good enough, if you want, to provide the basis to say whether systemic approaches work?
Thank you, Marcus, for that big question. I'm going to turn that question back to the audience here, so get your cards ready, please. But let me start by saying I really didn't want to do this when Marcus first asked me, but now the more I think about it, I feel like I've been let off my leash, because I'm going to talk strictly from one perspective, which is the perspective of a social scientist. I've never represented a donor. Even though I have great respect for the, their fiduciary responsibility and the political constraints that they have, I've never attempted to implement a project on the ground, and I have great respect for the constraints and the short time horizons and all the realities that they have to deal with. And all of these people, in general, I have found to be very dedicated to what they do. But I'm a social scientist, and I'm going to answer these questions from my perspective, and it may be at a 90-degree angle. So I do hope to find out whether I'm communicating. Most of the time, I'm constrained to communicate with either donors or practitioners or both. But I'm going to speak just strictly from my own view of the world. Let me put this question back. I'd really like to see I'd like you to hold up a green card if you would answer Marcus's question in the affirmative. Do you think that we have, or that we're producing the evidence we need to show that systems approaches work? Green if you think yes, we are. Red if you think no, we aren't. And orange if you think we've made some progress, but we have a ways to go. So let's see. Green, we are producing the evidence. I don't see many green cards, but I appreciate your bravery. Please hold up your green card. Red cards, there are quite a few red cards out there, and I'm not going to give middle choices anymore because I see a lot of orange cards. And people holding up 2 cards, that's just not quite right. Okay. From my perspective, the word evidence, as it's been used in the last 2 years, is a buzzword. And I use that in the sense that it hides more than it reveals. Let me say, there's a green card, yay! Let me say that instead of using this blanket obscuring word evidence, let's think about 5 components about what we need to do to understand whether we're accomplishing what we want to accomplish. First, what is being evaluated? And in evaluator language, that's called the evaluand. You know, systemic approaches, that's a really broad term, okay? That's really broad. Do we expect that every single thing that we can label a systemic approach, it's all going to work, or it's all not going to work? So let's consider what is being evaluated. Let's also consider what are the questions being asked. What do we mean by it works? What do we mean by it works? And again, are we, you know, and I want to get back to that in terms of where we need to go. So one component is what are we evaluating? Another component is what are the questions we're asking about what we mean by what works? Another question is what methods are we using? We tend to focus a lot of our discussion on methods, and one of the question rounds will say more about methods. But that's only one of these 5 components in my mind. A 4th one is how are we interpreting and communicating the findings? You know, Simon just mentioned that you can interpret the same finding in different ways, and that's, as an evaluator, I will say that is very true. You can give me exactly the same statistical results, and I can put a negative spin on it, or I can put a positive spin on it, depending on my preference. And there's a green card, yay! And then the 5th component is I would like to only use the word evidence in the phrase body of evidence. As a scientist, I would ask, have we accumulated a body of evidence that allows us to draw some general conclusions, that allows us to make some generalizations? And I'm going to come back to these different points at various times. But I think that this perspective of looking at the question of do we have enough, looking at it from these 5 components actually points us in the direction of where we need to go to improve. Number 1, I would advocate that we need a more careful delineation and categorization about what do we mean by systemic approach. Okay. There are some very specific types of interventions. Why would we lump them all under the same category? One type of systemic approach, I think was alluded to earlier, which is, and all of you are familiar with this, of trying to work with the input supply system so that they begin to see smallholder farmers as valuable customers, so that their mindset is changed. You know, that's a systemic change, that's a systemic approach. But there are a lot of other systemic approaches, for example, working with the buyers, working on the buying side of either specialized crops or commodities, and converting that system so that smallholder farmers are seen as valuable suppliers, and that they can produce quality products, and that they're able to produce quality products, and that they receive premiums for those. Those are different kinds of systemic approaches. Would we assume that either both have to work or both have to fail? I think that's not a very good approach. So systemic approach, systemic approaches are a range of interventions, and do we really expect all of them to work en masse, or do we expect some of them to work and some not? I think we need more consistency and agreement in the questions that are asked. And by this, I mean there are several very relevant questions that we can ask. We can ask about outreach. What are the number of target beneficiaries reached? We can ask about outcomes. What was the significance of the change that they did or did not experience? We can talk about sustainability. So, you know, sustainability is one of the selling points for systemic approaches, is that, you know, but that's a separate question from outreach, and sustainability aren't the same question. We can talk about inclusion and the depth of inclusion, and do you reach some of the previously excluded populations. And more recently, you know, I see some people in the community, many people asking about systemic change. That's a question, that's a legitimate question. Was systemic change achieved? But these are all distinguishable questions. And so in looking at the evidence, in looking at the findings, in looking at the studies on the map, we could ask ourselves, which of the questions are they attempting to address, right? We'll talk some more about methods, and I'm going to talk about humility toward methods. But one thing I would say is that we do need some additional methods development, particularly in the area of systemic change. You know, we're just beginning to experiment with different ways to measure systemic change, so we need methods, we need to test methods. That question of sustainability, that's not being tested. It's really not being tested. But what do we need? We need methods for testing that question. We need to know how to do post-project evaluation and how to use the data that were collected during the life of the project to contribute to a post-project evaluation. And then finally, I would say more broadly, we should be attempting to accumulate a body of evidence in each of these categories for specific intervention approaches, systemic approaches, with specific questions about how it's working. And so that's my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. From a practitioner point of view, we've seen that there have been a lot of amber and red cards. I didn't see what card you showed, Matt. Amber. Okay, but from your point of view, have been working in the field, have been struggling to get these interventions going. Do you think that the evidence that is currently produced is useful for you and your peers?
Yeah, thanks, Marcus, and maybe just to echo what Elizabeth was saying there. I think when Marcus first asked me to sit on this panel and speak on behalf of practitioners everywhere, yeah, you can see my challenge. So forgive me if I make some kind of broad sweeping generalizations, but I thought it was really interesting because actually a lot of what we do in our day-to-day, and we you know, a lot of what I've written about before has been, yeah, about methods, and this was really a kind of chance to look back at the big picture. And quite frankly, I think I do share your assessment of evidence, certainly in the organization I work and in previous experiences, become a bit of a buzzword. So actually, I think a lot of my answer to your question now would be, well, it depends on what we mean by evidence, but also evidence for who. And I think that's a really important distinction that I want to get into now. I was actually so confused, I went back to the dictionary to look up the definition of evidence, which apparently it means a body of facts that indicate whether a belief or position is valid, which is nice. But I think when we say evidence in development, quite frankly, we've got some very different interpretations about what this body of facts actually is and what we use it for. So again, kind of trawling through the big picture stuff, I came across I read it in a blog before, but it was a presentation at last year's 3IE conference that tried to distinguish between 3 different types of evidence, and I thought this was quite a kind of useful way to frame my experience as an implementer and a practitioner. So the kind of first type of evidence, they label knowledge-focused evidence. And they kind of define this as a generalizable, externally valid body of knowledge about what works to solve a problem. As an implementer, is this useful for me? Well, actually, I kind of thought about it and thought, probably not, no. Sadly to say, I mean, just, what worked elsewhere, it might inspire me, but I think there's huge risks of kind of copy and paste models. And I think the whole phrase, and there's a lot of debate around this in kind of complexity science, that what works, and terming it like that, kind of puts us into the realm of things that are quite mechanistic and linear and quite frankly, context neutral. And if you look at things like, I know Marcus is a big fan of Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework, it kind of puts us in the realm of simple problems. And I think as practitioners of market systems projects, we don't really always operate in the realm of simple. We often operate in quite complicated or complex contexts. So does a kind of this knowledge, this kind of body of knowledge, if it's kind of generalizable learning, does that really kind of help with the complexities of kind of navigating my way through many different pathways towards locally led systemic change, which is actually by definition kind of contextual? Yeah, I kind of thought not. Sorry, it's not all going to be such a downer, don't worry. The second type of evidence that they identified was called accountability-focused evidence. And they define this as a kind of independent, external, objectively verifiable proof of results. And the use here is usually kind of for donors or funders so they can make funding decisions. As a practitioner, yeah, of course, I definitely see the importance of this, and I think this kind of upwards accountability also kind of helps hold projects to task. But I think sometimes in the way that it's practiced, it's often seen as a kind of parallel to the implementing structure, and I think a lot of practitioners maybe see it as a bit of a necessary evil rather than a value add. And then a third type of evidence that they identified was decision-focused evidence. And this doesn't ask kind of what works to solve a generic problem, but it kind of flips that into the present tense, right? And it says what is working for who and how can we make it work better. And I think for me, this really resonated as an implementer, because what I want is kind of a body of facts for context-specific learning. And actually, that relates to a specific time, a specific place, a specific population, and a specific problem. So these are the three kind of types of evidence that they distinguish. But I think when we say evidence, we kind of often have some of these different meanings in mind, which then influence how we see evidence being used. And actually, when I think we have debates about evidence, we kind of speak at cross purposes. We're just meaning, one word to mean many different things. So, long way of answering a question. I think we're now starting to see more of these kind of accountability, decision-focused blends of evaluation and evidence, kind of more longitudinal studies that follow projects throughout its lifetime. And I think if we got more of those, I think it would make the evidence more useful.
Thank you, Matt, but I have to take you up on this a little bit, because in a recent blog post that you published, or we published on the Beam website, you painted a much bleaker picture actually about the use of evidence, and I quote your blog post here: "But why bother? Of all the problems with that current framing of evidence, the biggest is the assumption of rationality, that people actually use the available body of facts to inform whether their position is valid. Decisions are not systematically made based on information about effectiveness, but on what one impact investor has called the dance of deceit, set to the music of politics, perception, and persuasion." So Matt, why bother? Do you think this assessment is true both for funders of development and for the day-to-day work of practitioners?
Well, in the spirit of having contrarian debates and saying controversial things, yeah, you're going to have to listen to me speak again. Sorry. Yeah, well, I don't think we should bother if what we're going to do, quite frankly, is just kind of boost the supply and just pump that up without really kind of understanding the demand side, without really unpacking the use context. Otherwise, I think we're going to maybe get into some of the lessons, which I'll allude to, of the evaluation world over the last 20, 30 years, where we have lots of nice documents in a desk somewhere that nobody ever reads or uses to inform their decisions. I mean, to answer that in a bit more nuanced way, I think there's pretty crudely put two opposing worldviews here, kind of shaping the use context of the demand side. One, I'll kind of term it the rational actor theory, which it kind of sees evidence as apolitical, right? It's a kind of technical best practice thing. So if we actually collect more facts, then they're going to be used objectively and neutrally to inform decisions. I don't know how many of you live in that world. If you find it, I'd like to live in it. But I think this closely equates to a bit of the theory of change behind building up knowledge bases and behind building up an evidence base about what works. And I think this view, for those of you who know the kind of JPAL, IPA, RCT movements, is very strongly underpinned the kind of work that they're doing. And I think the other side, so that's one worldview, the other worldview kind of sees evidence as always political, right? And often, quite frankly, abused to further subjective interests or kind of justify existing prejudices. And I think this one recognizes that whatever evidence we're going to have is probably likely to be kind of complex, contested, and even actually, as you were saying earlier, quite contradictory. So I don't know. I think I wouldn't necessarily call it naive, but I think what we should try to guard against is just kind of assuming that we build and collect more evidence just on its own, that it's going to be used properly, right? And I think answering some of the points that have been raised here over the last couple of days, depending on how we define market systems, and particularly I think for an M4P approach, I'd actually probably argue that there's already like a fairly large body of facts that shows that in lots of contexts M4P works, right? All the way back from kind of stuff in Uganda in the 2000s to I think what David was presenting on FSD Africa and like many in between. So I'd actually question, is the problem when we're talking about evidence, is it just a supply side problem or is it something on the demand side as well? Because if the stuff's there, why isn't it being used and why are we calling for more of it? So yeah, I think at the same time, we probably should realize that implementers often don't always have really wholesome motivations for collecting evidence. And I outlined some 3 nice ones before, kind of decision, focused, accountability, and knowledge. I'd probably add to a 4th one, which might be kind of called showing off or something like that. We've, quite frankly, worked with a lot of projects who want to collect evidence, do RCTs, do quasi-experimental designs, do whatever, not because they want to learn, right, but because they think it's, the latest fad, they're going to jump on board and they want to generate kind of a buzz, basically, and attract more money. And I think, we have to recognize that there's actually many different competing motivations, and they're not always wholesome. So I think both you asked on the funder and the practitioner side. I think what I put in the blog, for those of you who haven't read it, and it was not my quote, it was from someone else, but about the politics, perception, persuasion, I think are, often important motivating factors. And if kind of spin over substance, I guess, if you will, some of the time. So I think the thing I would want to say is that we have to just be careful, I think, in market systems projects not to fall into that kind of trap that I think other parts of the kind of aid and development world maybe have fallen into, is that thinking that evidence is maybe a kind of apolitical what works, a kind of this inherent good that if we just, collect more of it, then everything's going to be fine. I think, this session today, I think is an opportunity to dig deeper into the reasons why maybe that assumption won't hold true.
Simon, how would you respond to this assessment? Do you think there is a need for change? Do you think we need to change something?
No, I wouldn't say we need to change something. I mean, I recognise a lot of what Matt says. I think, one is there will never be enough evidence, because I think, as I alluded to before, the evidence that you collect, the evidence we've got, will never answer all the questions that people are asking. So there will always be the need to look at things differently in a new way. I wanted to come to, in my sort of response to this, come to that issue, and Elizabeth, you referred to as well, as to how is the evidence used, and that's what I've always felt. I mean, I've headed a small research team before where, I really felt we weren't just producing research and providing a nice paper and putting it on a website. You have to put real effort into how the findings of that research are distributed and used. And I guess the challenge for me to this group is to think about that. And thinking about the market systems approach and you know, how you kind of promote it. And I think, you know, Jim alluded yesterday to the fact that across the world there are a lot of centre-right governments at the moment, and so when you're talking about markets in the private sector, you're pushing on an open door. You've got governments that are, you know, ideologically committed to working with the private sector. So that's, you know, in that sense, maybe it means that evidence is less important in terms of persuading our politicians that working on the private sector is a good thing. But I have to say, just from a different perspective at the moment, this is also part of my challenge. I think there's a general sense, a growing sense, that all of the studies we see of things working in particular contexts on projects for poor groups doesn't add up to the macro. Happening in the big numbers in terms of economic growth and to some extent poverty reduction. There's been enormous poverty reduction over the last 1 or 2 decades, but say in Africa it's been much less impressive than in Asia. So the challenge coming through DFID at the moment is how do we do things on a much bigger scale? So we have things like the billions to trillions agenda, which is how do we get the billions of investment in infrastructure, urbanization, how do we leverage it to the trillions that is needed over the next 10, 20 years, trillions every year? How are we going to deal with the fact that the population in Africa is projected to double by 2050 to 2.5 billion people, and that the population in African cities is projected to triple over the same period? So these are the really big questions. Now, market systems approaches cannot solve all of that, but it's just the reason why I raise it is I think you really need to be conscious of where the thinking is, and therefore thinking about how you can use the evidence you've got to show how market systems approaches can help address what is kind of top of in political thinking at the moment. You can also think about how you can get political backing. You know, who is going to support in the countries where different donors reside? Who is going to support your case in that development agency, in that government? It doesn't have to be somebody in the government. It could be an ex-government minister, or it could be somebody who's just very influential over that government. The 5, is that for me or is that for you?
That's for me.
Okay, right. So very quickly. So and then just the last thing is just to think. You know, be realistic about what the politicians can focus on. I think, you know, there can be more work bringing their attention to this kind of stuff, but, you know, bear in mind, politicians are kind of drawn into the issues of the day, like migration, terrorism. Our politicians have manifesto commitments which are not about market systems. They're about, I know, vaccination, about education, about social sectors. So just be conscious of how much space they've got to look at different things.
Thank you, Simon. I think this is really fascinating how we see here kind of 2 really slightly different perspectives, or maybe not slightly, but quite different perspectives being drawn up from kind of a practitioner-focused view on what you called micro, very decision-focused, very time-bound, very context-specific towards, but how do we get then the bigger picture, and how can we make the big decisions that are needed in the current global environment. This leads me to the question for Elizabeth. How do you, as a supplier of evidence from your social scientist perspective, how do you perceive the incentive structure that this kind of builds up around evidence? Who is shaping what kind of evidence is produced at the moment, and who is kind of deciding whether it's useful and what kind of use it is for.
Well, I'm going to go back to what I said previously, which is that when I hear evidence, I think of 5 different components. And I want to focus in, we could focus on any of these components and ask what influences those, but I want to focus on methods, since a lot of people are really concerned about methods. And I want you to get your cards again. And I want you to tell me who you think has the greatest influence on the methods used in evaluation. Do you think that the donors have the most influence over what methods are used in evaluation? If so, let's see a green card. Do you think that implementers have the greatest influence on what methods are used in evaluation? Let's see a red card. Or do you think that evaluators and academics have the greatest influence on what methods are used? So, green card, donors have the greatest influence on what methods are used in evaluation. Okay, red cards. Implementers have the greatest influence on what methods are used in evaluation. Okay, we're seeing a little bit of mix here. Orange cards, evaluators and academics have the greatest influence on what methods are used in evaluation. Okay, well I see oh, you can't hold up 2 cards. I see a much more even opinion here. And so I'd like to give my opinion as someone who has done a lot of evaluation. I think that donors primarily select what they require in terms of evaluation, but I think that they are influenced by academics and researchers. And if you look very closely, that was your 2 cards, okay. If you look very closely, if you kind of go on the inside, and not everyone in the donor community selects. There are influential people within the donor community who say, we want, for example, randomized controlled trials. If you go to the Millennium Challenge Corporation, they're very dedicated to randomized controlled trials. But if you look closely, they've been influenced by a thought leader or a trusted academic or researcher who has convinced them that this is the case. And why is that? Because honestly, you can get pretty specialized. It can be the discipline of evaluation and social science research can get very specialized, and we don't expect most people to really understand it in detail. And so that's why donors turn to academics for that reassurance, for somebody who they trust, who they think understands what's going on. So the question then for me is, how do academics and researchers decide what methods should be used? Okay. There's the ideal answer, and then there's the real world answer. In the ideal case, we would hope that an academic would do a very careful and thorough study, looking at alternative methods and developing a deep understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of the alternative methods, and where they're most applicable, and then making some very informed and unbiased recommendation. So that's the ideal case. How does it really happen? Okay. How do academics come, and researchers, how do they come to favor certain methods? Well, of course, I'm not going to say that none of them look closely, because I do. I look closely at all methods. But all these other people, let me point out something that's implicit, which is the disciplinary home. By discipline, I mean like I'm an economist, okay? And I'm trained, and I was trained within the discipline of economics, which heavily favors econometric and statistical methods, okay? If we go even deeper with my disciplinary home, I'm an agricultural economist. And within agricultural economics in the United States, that's placed in land-grant colleges where there is more emphasis on environmental economics. So I'm schooled in some of those methods of willingness to pay and other things that are used in environmental economics. And even further, you look at the particular department. I got my PhD at the University of Wisconsin, go Badgers. And University of Wisconsin has a very proud tradition of being a home of institutional economics within the world. And so I'm schooled in those methods as well, but it's just serendipitous because I happen to have gone to that school. And then, so as researchers, we inhale these influences without even really making it explicit. Secondly, we turn to our mentors and we turn to thought leaders in the field. So again, the understanding scientific approach is pretty complicated. We can't get into all the details of everything, so we turn to somebody we trust. And we say, well, if this person says that method is good, they're smart. It must be a good method. And so I begin to advocate for a method just because somebody I respect has advocated for that method. Okay, those to me are both benign, not so well understood influences, but there's another influence that's not so benign, and that is the very human instinct to build a reputation. To build credibility and a reputation and become somebody who's really important within a field that the donors want to turn to, that always gets invited to conferences. Thank you for having me. And one of the best ways to build a huge reputation is to develop a method, to give it an acronym, and to sell it everywhere. Okay? And your reputation depends on how good or important your method is considered to be. And sadly enough, one of the ways to get my method to be considered the best is for me to denigrate and put down and deny and dismiss the validity of other people's methods. And so that's just part of the climate that's going on, and we should realize that a lot of times, I'm not going to say that researchers and academics are bad people, because we're not, and I'm not going to say that we don't know everything, because honestly we don't, but we have these influences in what we consider to be the right way to do things, and sadly there's this tendency toward trying to dismiss the things that I'm not advocating. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So you can hear we're all very passionate about this, and we could probably go on and on, but I realize there are many people out there who would also like to voice their opinions and say something. But before we go into kind of an open question and answer and discussion session, and in the spirit of BEAM being a networking organization, I would like to ask you to turn to your table, the table you sit at, and have a brief discussion, 5 minutes, with the people you sit at the table with, and reflecting on what was discussed on the panel, what of the aspects of the discussion are actually confirmed in your reality, and where do you not agree with what has been said on the panel? Where do you think you have a quite distinctly different opinion? And we'll pick a couple of tables afterwards to reflect to the plenary, but first of all, please look at your table and discuss a little bit about these questions.
Can you repeat?
Yeah, the question was, where does your experience in the real world reflect what was discussed on the panel here? What aspects confirm your reality, and where do you not agree with what has been said by the people on the panel here? Hello. All right, thank you very much. So as I said, I would like to ask a couple of tables to reflect on the discussions, but really focus on the points. Where did you agree with what was said here? Where is it confirmed in your day-to-day life? And where do you disagree with what has been said here? So who wants to wrap up the discussion of their table, sum up the discussion?
There was a point where you said that donors put out what they want, and the academics actually put a stamp on the evaluation methods. But I honestly think that innovation around evaluation is actually done at the project level by the implementers. So basically, there are donors who look for these evidences, and when the implementers put out the methodologies for evaluation, the donors look for a rationale and look whether there is a logical strategy behind it, whether the quality of analysis is right. But I think it's basically at the implementers level, at the project level, who are implementing the project. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. There was one person right in the back.
Hello. Oh, good. All right, thank you. I didn't understand the bulk of the conversation. So you'll excuse me if this is totally irrelevant. But I want to refer to what Elizabeth asked about who has the most influence. And I'm thinking it came across as the donor and the researcher. The speaker who has just spoken has talked about implementers. And I think it is because the partnership here is imbalanced. When the researcher and the donor have the highest influence, yet it is the implementer who is at the point of pain, then you have a situation where an evaluation becomes like you did it wrong or you did it well, rather than a process of discovery that enables both the donor, researcher, and the implementer to come out with a learning that is commonly owned and showing progress towards a certain direction. I would be recommending that we look at an evaluation and evidence gathering system that brings all these three towards learning together rather than being you against us. That's my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have anyone else who would like to reflect on the discussion? There's one person there.
Good morning. Our table discussed the idea that we thought something might have been missing in this discussion. We're talking about the politics of evidence for market systems, and we looked at how the donors might be changing their perspectives and the center-right governments and some of the changing perspectives, but inevitably we didn't really discuss the role that market systems might be playing in the governments and in the countries that we're working in, and how the governments might be changing their attitudes in these places where we've seen so much aid dependency, we've seen so many debates about debt aid and about all of these challenges, and the need to actually have evidence for the local governments in the countries we work in to push for market systems types of interventions. And as donors are more and more looking towards governments and their 5-year development strategies to actually design their projects, then maybe the politics of how we use evidence to show that market systems types of projects can work can then influence the governments in the countries we work in and then influence those donors.
Thank you very much. There is another.
Thank you. So I'm Cyril Komesli. I work for SDC in Bangladesh. And I just would like to link to what you just said. I think you hit a very important topic here, which we should look at much more. We were at our table discussing in relation to that about the Beam Exchange platform. Is the Beam Exchange platform already a platform which provides the evidence or the information which we, as the development partners and the host governments, really are interested in? I understand also in the discussions we're having here, we're discussing very important things for the practitioners, for the implementers, and there's no doubt that these are important. But if I also look at the data you showed, only 15, I don't remember, % or 15 studies looked actually into poverty alleviation. So for us as a development partner, or also for the host government, market systems development is just one of the approaches, one of the avenues we can take, but there's also many others. So we need much more at the level of impact or outcomes to know whether this is really the right avenue to take. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to open it further, not just to answer these specific questions, but have a general discussion, question and answer session.
I've been struck in recent years about the way that we use data, and data can be used either as a control mechanism to actually say that the hypothesis which you preordained for your project is the right one, and if the data shows something different, you've done something wrong. And yet the other side, that what I was talking about yesterday about the whole participatory process, is that data is in fact enlightenment. It is actually showing you something that you didn't know, and it's showing you something completely unexpected. And I think when we talk about evidence, I think we need to expand this idea away from saying, are we actually simply trying to collect data about a hypothesis, which is only just that. It is a hypothesis, and we don't know if it works or it doesn't work. If you think back to the guys like Charles Darwin, who simply observed what was going on around and inferred, he was enlightened by the data that he saw in order to create the general theory of evolution. And we don't do that kind of data collection these days. We tend to only collect the data according to a change pathway, and I think that's worrying.
Thank you. There is Jim all the way in the back.
Thanks. I mean, I think the whole discussion here around the politics of evidence is absolutely critically important, but I think we need to recognise that doesn't mean we don't want evidence. So there's always going to be contestation, and I think what we need to be working for, how do you get people having the most informed discussions they can? And so that's recognising that's always this switch between having the best evidence you can, getting the overarching picture, and recognising the politics, and that these are always going to go together. So just, I guess, just a warning there that it doesn't mean to say we should throw evidence out, because we desperately need it, and we need to use it as best we can.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just go with Todd there in the back.
Yeah, my name is Todd Flower. I kind of hijacked our table conversation, so thanks for the opportunity to just throw it out here. So the evidence issue I find a little bit confusing, because I feel like we're basically, the way that we get to our approaches is we're essentially begging for flexibility in a system that doesn't allow for it. And when donors say, you need to give us evidence of your approach, we're not necessarily doing things in implementation of a systems approach that are different from a traditional approach. We just know why we got there. We didn't just guess and say, well, we need to work with farmers, or we need to work with processors, or we go through a process of elimination, and we're begging for flexibility to continue doing that. So but the system that we exist in with the donors, they don't like complexity. They want silver bullets, because those are easy to sell. So I guess I'm overall confused by the desire for more evidence of a systemic approach. Or should we just be really targeting the people that make the decisions that allow us flexibility? Because I think those are the people, if we can get that flexibility, I mean, as opposed to what? I mean, a direct service delivery approach or a livelihoods approach? I don't think there's a lot of evidence that those are effective, but those are alive and thriving all over the place. So I think the challenge is just more the system that we exist in, and how do we get the flexibility to do what we think a process of elimination to get to the right approaches.
I think there was one hand back there, Charlie, yes, and then we'll go back to this side.
Hello, can you hear me? I was fascinated by Elizabeth's discussion about the distance from the politics of who decides about where evidence comes from. We at ITAB, we work in the implementation side, in developing monitoring measurement systems, and on the independent evaluation side. And the independence of the researcher and evaluator is being discussed in a lot of detail at the moment, and the extent to which there is a need to be independent. And certainly something that DFID has set up is longitudinal evaluation management units to be designed right from the start when the program is also designed. And the main purpose of that is to actually design the evidence generation framework together in a participatory way, such that it is valuable for the for the donor and for the body of evidence that's then generated for learning more broadly outside of that program. So I just wonder from the room about if anybody has had experience with that sort of design and the value that they think that could bring.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm not sure if we can answer the question, but just maybe a show of hands who does have experience in this sort of design of longitudinal studies where there is a lot of interaction between the evaluators and the team. So there is a couple of hands. Yeah. Okay, it's very interesting. Thank you. I would like to have one last comment from back there. I don't remember exactly who it was, but yes, Rubaiyat.
Thank you. I wanted to key into the point that you made about complexity. No one loves complexity. I mean, even though we are living in the complex world, we need to make it simple for people. So the point that I was missing here in the discussion is, what do we exactly mean by evidence? The point is, let's say if you punch someone and someone is bleeding, I mean, there is no evidence that punching is leading to bleeding if you haven't recorded that event, right? So you see bleeding, you didn't see the punching is not leading to bleeding. So that's one point. So it's about recording the actual event that's taking place. Now, when we are talking about recording, what exactly are we recording? Now, if you replace punching with market development and bleeding with systems change, it becomes so vague for people to understand what exactly has happened. And exactly that's the realm where we are working in. So we're replacing, I mean, some very specific indicators with very vague terms, which is different for different people. We can quiz people here who have been working on market development for 12, 13 years, and you'll find different definition of it. So I think, I mean, the basic of it should be coming to a consensus about what exactly we mean by evidence. That's one. What exactly are we recording? And number two is, when we have decided and agreed upon what we mean by evidence, the point is, how are we going to do it? Now, in our table, we were discussing about how it is done in, let's say, health systems, where you are probably trying to do RCTs to find out whether bed nests are effective. Now, let's say you have found bed nests, innovated bed nests, you see whether these are effective. Now, you do a pilot, you do RCTs, and you establish the fact. Once you have established the fact, you scale it up. And there's no question then to go back and quiz the question whether bed nests are effective. You're quizzing the question whether you are being effective on distributing bed nets. So it's the same point that we can bring in here in market development. If we're saying that market development works because of this and that reasons, there's no point, I mean, asking this question and trying to find it out, which was very much present in the first presentation that Marcus, you're presenting, that market development works. I think it's futile to go back to that debate after 13 years. Now the question is, what exactly are we delivering, and put it down in simple terms. Punching leading to bleeding. I think that's something that we are missing here.
Thank you very much for these contributions. I want to get the discussion back here to the panel with the final round. And excuse me if I start with Matt again, because your blog, I found it really interesting. But you're also, in your blog, you're quoting Mike Field, whom many of you know as a very seasoned practitioner. And Mike apparently said that much of what we are currently defining as evidence is not really evidence, as it does not provide insight or understanding. Now, could you elaborate a little bit on that, Matt, and how would you think evidence would look like that does actually provide insight and understanding?
Yeah, just a very quick reflection, because I think there's no easy answers to this, and I think these kind of sessions start helping us unpack some of the questions about kind of what's evidence and for who. But I think all of us is kind of interested in market systems kind of probably are starting to there's growing acceptance of the fact that systemic change isn't a kind of event, right? It's a process. It's not really always a black and white, but it's something we work towards incrementally in its many shades of gray. So I think when we're unpacking evidence a little bit more, I think we have to be careful that we're not kind of treating evidence as something static as well. I think that was kind of Mike's, really big point that I agree with in his microlinks blog, is that these kind of single big outreach figures, a standalone impact assessment reports, they're all kind of simple things, right? In the blog, I called it the magic evidence metric, like 2 million farmers have improved their incomes. Oh, it's great, wonderful, but kind of what does that actually tell us about how systems are changing? I think we're all in this because we're interested in kind of transformational development, not transactional development, where the kind of how matters as much as the what. So I think we just have to be a bit careful that I think if we set ourselves up as just looking at the kind of the ends of the numbers, we're going to be measured against the same criteria as direct delivery programs. And that's, you know, we're doing something fundamentally different. I think the evidence that would provide meaning and insight is about the process, is about what we were saying before. We're making a hypothesis about one particular way we think we can get to systemic change. Are the kind of sustainability hypotheses we're making valid or not? Are the scale hypotheses valid or not? Is the kind of pro-poor value hypothesis valid or not? And I think maybe at that micro level, if we can get evidence, if we can get better data-driven decisions that kind of reject or accept those hypotheses, maybe over time we can kind of build up that more macro body of evidence that will actually kind of, you know, show us how, as a community, we've managed to kind of probe and search our way contextually towards systemic change. It might help not just the kind of decision focus for what we do in our day jobs, but the kind of demand for accountability and the demand to kind of show that things are working.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Elizabeth, now this is not going to be an easy question to be answered in a couple of minutes, but maybe you can just give us a little brush up. What do you think, how should evaluations be designed in order not to run after this imaginary goal of rigor, but cater to the real needs that we heard today from different perspectives for people in real decision-making positions?
Yeah, let me address first this term rigor, and then some ideas for how to do evaluation in ways, generate evidence that will lead to greater insight and decision making. A lot of people, I think the predominant view on rigor is that that sophisticated statistical techniques have been used. I mean, that's the way I hear it most often used, that not only were statistics used, but they were advanced statistics that controlled for selection bias. And that's one way that the term rigor is used. Another way that I think is perhaps more valid, way that I see rigor used quite a lot, is that a sound scientific method was followed, that a protocol for the research was carefully laid out, and then each step of the way followed a good scientific method. And that's one way that rigor is used. Another way that I hear rigor used a lot is, my way was good, so it was rigorous. I mean, it's like a shield on a report. It was a rigorous method. Just means, don't ask me about this method because it was good. I don't use rigor in any of those ways. I have my own definition that I borrowed from a colleague. Some of you may know Mark Schreiner, who helped to, really was instrumental behind the Simple Poverty Scorecard and still works on that today. Anyway, when he first said it, it made such sense to me, and I've used it for years. And I would say that rigor is transparency. Rigor is clarity about the strengths and weaknesses of your conclusions and the approach that you followed. And so a rigorous study is one in which the strengths and weaknesses of the conclusions are clearly communicated. To me, that's rigor. And so that's one of the things that I think we need in order to produce evidence that provides more insight and understanding, is we need to have humility. We need to have humility about our methods and not get into this defensive situation of my method is best and your method is terrible. We need to have, and along with that comes appreciation for what other people are doing and not dismissing things that you don't understand. That's one thing. A second thing that hasn't been mentioned, although I had breakfast with Ryan and he shared with me that John Oliver, the comedian, actually just did a skit or an explanation of this. And I think one of the things that's really harming our ability to gain insight is the pressure towards sound bites. sound bites and the whole tweeting idea, give me the bottom line, my boss is a really busy person and she only wants to know the final conclusion out of your evaluation, that is doing as much as anything to really destroy the quality of of what we're learning from evaluations. Because you're trying to reduce the conclusions of something that is nuanced, that does have specific applicability and specific weaknesses and strengths, and you're reducing it into a statement that, frankly, I think is quite misleading. And if you just think, John Oliver was talking about health information. I mean, if you, for the last 20 years, have tried to have listened to the media about what you should be eating or how you should be exercising or whether you should be, I'm old, whether you should eat eggs or not eat eggs, I mean, you get it's very misleading. It's not because of the scientists. As a trained social scientist, I go back and read the original studies, and they don't say at all what's reported in the media. They say something much more complex, much more nuanced. And so I think sound bites are a problem. I've mentioned post-project evaluation. I think this is an area where we need to figure out how to do this. Where are if we're going to claim sustainability, we need to go back and try to figure out, can we show that it's happening? Is it really happening? Just because we think it is doesn't mean that it's really happening. And so we need the incentives for post-project evaluation. We need somebody to fund it. And we need methods for using the data that were collected earlier in a meaningful way. And finally, as I mentioned at the very beginning, personally, I think as a community, we need to debate and agree on some terms and some categories and pin some of these things down. And rather than talk about systemic approaches in general, let's talk about 6 or 7 predominant systemic approaches. Rather than talk about, does it work, let's be specific. Are we talking about outreach? Are we talking about outcomes? Are we talking about sustainability? What are we talking about? And so in order to accumulate meaningful evidence, and again, I disagree with Matt's, and I know he was just doing it to be provocative, idea that we don't need to accumulate a body of knowledge. I think we do need a body of knowledge, and the only way we're going to do that is by replicating some of the same questions about the same things. And so that's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I would like to give the last word to Simon. And one thing that struck me, and I did in my work for BEAM, I did this evaluation, what we call evaluation synopses, where we wrote the people who did these evaluations wrote 4 or 5 pagers, and most of them are funded by DFID. And what struck me is that they are very diverse in terms of what methodology they use, what approach they use, but there are all these kind of longitudinal studies that are done alongside the project. So I'd like to ask you to talk a bit about this and the thinking around evaluation in DFID. Briefly, if you don't mind.
Briefly, yes, I know. I saw the 2 minutes come up about 5 minutes ago. So very briefly, I mean, yeah, evaluation is very important to us. It's a professional cadre in DFID now, so people get accredited by having done evaluations and yeah, so having kind of work experience as well as knowledge in how to do evaluations. And we have lots of people who are peppered through the organisation. They may be economists, private sector advisors, infrastructure advisors, but also evaluation accredited. So I think it shows the importance of it for our organisation. I looked it up for this session. Well, what kind of evaluations do we have? And our evaluation department lists 3. We impact evaluations, which look at causal attribution, performance evaluations that look at the contribution of a particular intervention to an outcome, and process of evaluations which ask whether an intervention did what was expected. So different evaluations are chosen for different purposes. You know, it could be to do with the size of the program or the type of question you're trying to answer. I did just want to respond just as the last word on the whole political question and say, well, yes, I very much take the point that you need to look at evidence in the countries that we're working in as well. And I think I've heard examples around the room in this last day and a bit of where people are using evidence for political purposes to make projects work, and we do that as well, and that's absolutely right. But yeah, I was just talking from the perspective of one donor, and yeah, and also just to say, while I focused a lot because I thought it was important to say on how you use the evidence for political purposes in the UK, I did want to say that actually the vast bulk of our research and evidence collecting and so on, has nothing to do with questions politicians are asking. It's all about trying to make our programs work better. And the one thing that does become political is obviously budgets need to be allocated for it. Politicians need to know that we're getting value for money out of all of our evidence collection and evaluation work. And at the moment, that seems to be kind of working for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all three of you very, very much for your contributions. I was very delighted also by the very rich contributions from the room. So thank you to everyone. I just want to have a last round with your cards. So if you still have them around, has your idea about evidence shifted during this discussion when you compare it back to when you came in this morning? Red for no, green for yes, amber for maybe a little bit. I'm very happy that we see quite a few green cards. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.